They thought she was just an old woman with shaky hands and a polite smile. What they didn't know was that those hands once echoed through concert halls with breathtaking brilliance. And that smile? It masked a lifetime of sacrifice. This is the story of Eleanor Reed. Pa's Eleanor Ellie Reed was 79 years old, and she lived the kind of life most people never noticed. Her days were quiet, deliberate. Mornings always began the same. She'd walk past the sun-dappled window of her modest home, pour a cup of black tea, and take her seat at the grand piano that had followed her through every chapter of her life. Its once polished wood was now worn at the corners, its ivory keys slightly yellowed with age, but it was still her most loyal companion. She'd place her hands gently on the keys, and for 1 hour every day, the world outside disappeared. Eleanor hadn't always been invisible. Decades ago, she was a rising star in the classical music. Worldwide, a scholarship student at a top conservatory, praised for her precision and heart. She was supposed to debut in Vienna. There were plans for London, a tour, a recording contract. But then the call came. Her parents were gone. A car accident. 3 younger siblings suddenly had no one but her. She left school the next morning. The career faded. The spotlight dimmed. But Eleanor never stopped playing. Not for fame, not for applause. Just for herself. Years passed. The siblings grew up. Life continued as it always does. And while the world forgot Eleanor Reed, she never forgot the music. She taught for decades in the local school, guiding hundreds of students. One of them was a shy little girl with quick fingers and a big heart. Nora. Now grown, Nora still lived down the street. She often visited Eleanor, bringing warm muffins and cooler conversation. One morning, Nora arrived with something else. Excitement. Ellie, she said, breathless, you're going to be on Spotlight Talent. Eleanor blinked. Excuse me? I submitted a video. You playing Debussy last spring. They called me yesterday. You've been selected. Eleanor laughed softly, shaking her head. Nora, I haven't performed in public in 50 years. I know, Nora said gently, but maybe it's time. A long silence settled between them. Eleanor looked over at her piano, then at her. Weathered hands. There was still music in them. That much she knew. But was that enough? For a moment, she heard her younger self whispering from the past. One day. Maybe this was that day. I suppose, Eleanor said slowly. I could dust off something special, Nora beamed. You won't regret it. But not everyone shared that sentiment. In a high-rise production office downtown, the team behind Spotlight Talent was already plotting the lineup. Elderly pianist, Rick Caldwell, the show's charming but smug host, arched an eyebrow. Perfect. We'll warm the crowd up with a little comedy. Tasha, the young producer at the table, frowned. She's not a novelty act, Rick. She's a real musician, Rick smirked. Trust me, no one under 40 wants to hear Chopin at 8 p.m. on a Thursday night. We'll give her a moment, then move on. Tasha said nothing, but deep down, something felt off. Because she'd seen the video, and she'd heard the music. And what she heard was not a novelty. It was something else. Something rare. Something the world wasn't ready for. Eleanor Reed was about to take the stage. And for the first time in half a century, Shido backstage was buzzing, lights flashing, assistants racing, voices crackling through headsets. But one thing was clear, no one expected greatness from the woman in the cardigan. They didn't bring Eleanor Reed to Spotlight Talent because they believed in her. They brought her for a moment of levity. A break between the dance crew and the fire juggler, something cute, harmless, forgettable. In the corner of the control booth, Rick Caldwell, host, charmer, professional showman, was getting his notes. Eleanor Reed, 79, retired music teacher, says she's been playing piano since age 5, a producer read. Rick smirked. So, basically my Nana at Thanksgiving? Laughter. Someone added, just keep it light, Rick. Throw in a joke or two. Warm. Up the crowd. She probably plays chopsticks with feeling, another crew member quipped. Backstage, Eleanor sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't wearing sequins or dramatic makeup. No stage costume, just a soft lavender blouse, a pearl pin, and poise. She had heard them, not every word, but enough. Cute moment. Chopsticks. Hope she doesn't fall off the bench. Eleanor didn't flinch. She closed her eyes. Let the noise fade, and she breathed. When asked to submit her piece weeks ago, she'd chosen a standard. Something lyrical, safe. But now, in this moment, she made a different choice. Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, Scarbo, a piece considered one of the most technically challenging in the entire piano repertoire. Nightmarish even for professionals. Let them laugh, let them scoff. They had no idea what was coming. Cue the lights. Rick Caldwell strutted to center stage, flashing that signature grin. Okay, folks, he said, his voice bouncing through the theater. Our next act is something a little slower. Light chuckles from the audience. She's been playing piano since before disco was invented, so please put your hands together before she forgets why she's here. More laughter. Rick grinned wider, sensing the crowd's rhythm. And let's all hope this piano has life alert built in. The crowd erupted. Eleanor stepped into the spotlight. She walked slowly, but with purpose. Not one person in that audience saw a threat. Not one person saw a virtuoso. They saw a grandmother, a sweet old woman with a modest smile and careful steps. But when Eleanor sat at the bench, something changed. She straightened her spine, rolled her shoulders, let her fingers hover just above the keys. The theater quieted slightly. Maybe it was her stillness, her calm, or something unseen. And then she played, not softly, not tentatively, but with absolute command. The opening bars of Scarbo shattered the assumptions in the room. Dark, eerie, technically ruthless. Notes spilled like fire from her fingertips, left hand thundering, right hand dancing with impossible agility. The room froze. Laughter stopped. Rick Caldwell, still near the wings, took a step forward, his expression blank. Backstage, the crew stared at the monitors. Tasha put down her headset. She couldn't speak, because in that moment, Eleanor Reed wasn't just playing a piece. She was reclaiming every stage she'd never stood on, every ovation she'd never received. She wasn't just defying expectations. She was obliterating them. Would be seen. It began with a single note, sharp, clear, deliberate. Then another, and another. Until suddenly the studio was filled with a cascade of sound, rapid-fire arpeggios rippling from Eleanor's fingers like water over glass. Gasps rose, caught in throats. The room froze. What had moments ago been a sea of laughter and low expectations was now breathless. The lights dimmed without a cue, as if the theater itself knew to step back and let something greater unfold. On stage, Eleanor was no longer the elderly woman with the quiet smile. She was power, precision, purpose. Her hands, wrinkled, worn by time, moved with a mastery that belied every assumption in the room. Each finger stroke was a declaration. You were wrong about me. Backstage, Rick Caldwell's smirk dissolved. His eyebrows lifted. His jaw slackened. He took one small step forward, then stopped, as though approaching sacred ground. On camera, Eleanor's face came into full view. Eyes closed, breathing steady. Entirely immersed. She wasn't performing for applause. She was communing with the music, with the life she might have had, with every unplayed stage that existed only in dreams. And now, it was real. The audience sat motionless, mesmerized, phones forgotten, whispers silenced. Even the crew behind the cameras stood still, grips, techs, even the director frozen in place. One of the judges, a former concert pianist herself, leaned forward in her chair, eyes wide. She mouthed the words silently. This is genius. On the monitors backstage, something else was happening. A stream of notifications began flashing. Tweets, reels, live reactions. Who is this woman? Just turned on the TV. And I'm crying. I don't know who she is, but I'll never forget her. Eleanor Reed is everything right now. In the wings, young producer Tasha clutched her tablet to her chest. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Not because it was beautiful, but because she knew, in that moment, that the world had just been reintroduced to a greatness it had carelessly forgotten. And no one could look away. The final chord lingered, suspended in the air like the very breath of memory. Then, silence. Not the awkward kind, not the unsure kind, but the kind born of reverence, the kind that follows something sacred. For a full heartbeat, then two, the room didn't move. It couldn't. Eleanor's hands slowly lifted from the keys, trembling just slightly. Now, not from age, but from everything she had just released. Then, like thunder breaking after still air, the studio erupted. The audience leapt to their feet, cheers, shouts, hands clapping raw, tears on cheeks, strangers turning to each other. In disbelief. It wasn't polite applause. It was testimony. A crowd declaring in one voice, "We were wrong, and she is magnificent." The judges stood too, not out of obligation but sheer instinct. One dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering, "Unforgettable." Another simply placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head. Backstage, the phones buzzed with frenzy. Eleanor Reed was already viral. And then Rick Caldwell stepped back on stage. But the man who had smirked, who had cracked jokes about Life Alert and chopsticks, was gone. In his place stood someone humbled. He approached, her slowly, almost cautiously, then looked out at the audience and said, voice hushed, "Miss Reed, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that." He turned to face her. No jokes, no performance, only awe. "You didn't just play music tonight. You told a story the whole world needed to hear." Eleanor smiled softly, graciously, the kind of smile that forgives long before it needs to, and behind her, the applause continued, unending, unrelenting, because once the world had dismissed her, now it couldn't look away. As the applause finally softened, the head judge stood, microphone in hand, voice still thick with emotion. "Miss Reed," he said, steadying himself, "what you just gave us was not a performance. It was a revelation." He stepped forward, eyes bright with admiration. "I'd be honored to offer you a featured solo with the State Symphony this season. Our audience deserves to hear you again." Gasps echoed through the theater. Someone in the crowd even cheered. Another judge, a renowned pianist and educator, leaned into her mic. "I run a conservatory," she said. "We train some of the world's best young musicians, but they've never seen what we just witnessed." She smiled. "Would you consider mentoring with us? Just one class, one conversation. I think you'd change lives." Eleanor turned, caught off guard not by the offers, but by the sincerity behind them. Her eyes swept across the audience, faces, young and old, all looking at her not with pity, but with reverence, and slowly she stepped forward. She didn't take the mic. She didn't raise her voice, but somehow every ear in the room heard her clearly. "I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong," she said. "I came to remind myself I was still right." A pause. Then the audience stood again. No music this time. No spotlight. Just the echo of truth, spoken plainly and lived boldly. Eleanor Reed, forgotten by time, underestimated by design, had reminded the world that greatness doesn't expire. It just waits for its moment. 6 months later, the grand hall is packed. Velvet seats stretch back row after row. Chandeliers glow above like frozen fireworks. The air hums, not with noise, but with anticipation. On stage, a Steinway grand waits under a soft, golden spotlight. Then, from the wings, she appears. Eleanor Reed. No longer just the quiet woman from a forgotten generation. Now, a name spoken with respect, with awe. She crosses the stage slowly, gracefully, not with the nerves of an amateur, but the quiet confidence of someone who's waited her entire life for this moment. In the front row, Nora wipes away a tear and joins the thunderous applause. And seated just beside her, Rick Caldwell, once the face of snide introductions, rises to his feet and leads the ovation. This time, he doesn't hold a microphone. This time, his role is simply to honor. As Eleanor adjusts the bench and places her fingers on the keys, A hush falls over the crowd. But before she plays, a whisper breaks the silence, gentle, hopeful. A little girl leans into her mother's arm and says, "I want to play like her one day." The mother smiles softly, eyes never leaving the stage. And as Eleanor begins her first notes, delicate and full of depth, the hall fills with something more than sound. It fills with legacy, because some performances echo long after the music fades. And Eleanor's? It's still playing. Inspired fingers, in opened minds, in hearts newly awakened to what's possible, at any age. It's never too late to be heard. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments, and share this with someone who's waiting for their moment. Have you ever been judged? Before you even spoke? Dismissed? Overlooked? Because of your age, your gender, your appearance? Eleanor reminds us of something too many forget. Greatness doesn't age out. It evolves, deepens, and when given the chance, it shines. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's forgotten how much they still carry inside. Someone who needs to be reminded. Their gift is not gone, just waiting to be heard again. Tap that subscribe button to join a community that believes in second chances, and tell us in the comments below. Where are you watching from today? We'd love to hear your story.